Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. It's a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 1st of August 2023. It's not a great amount of detail coming out of some of the sources, or many of the sources, concerning the front line. I think it's maybe marginally quieter than we have seen it, possibly even quieter than yesterday. As most of the talk in the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, is about this northeastern sector, and actually there's not a great deal going on along actually the eastern front here. Bakhmut, there has been some movement, but it's kind of slow and incremental. Avdiivka, no attacks from the Ukrainians, so we'll kind of bypass that area, and then a bit of activity in the south. So let's go to this northern area. Just before we do, let's dip into this. UK Defence Ministry has said Russian units are struggling with battle fatigue and ammunition shortages. It's a general kind of statement there. Intense fighting in two sectors of Ukraine's southern front line is wearing down the Russian defending forces, according, as I say, to the UK Defence Ministry intelligence report. Right, the ISW says of that northeastern sector, Ukrainian Deputy Defence Minister Hanna Maliar stated that Russian forces attempted to advance south of Novoselivska and push Ukrainian troops across the Oskil River, which runs west of Svatova. Okay, this is interesting because the Oskil River is quite a long way to the west of where we're talking about here. So in terms of Svatova here, we have Kupiansk up here to Svatova, to Kreminna down there. Northeast of Svatova, we have northwest, sorry, of Svatova, we have Stelmakivka, and just north of there, Kuzymivka, and a small town of Novoselivska. We have the Zherebets River coming down there, and I wonder whether that's what the ISW really means, because the Oskil River is all the way over here. There's a larger river that comes down from Kupiansk, but it kind of veers away from this P66 or R66 highway, or the highway veers away from the river, and where there is activity around Novoselivska is towards the Zherebets River that then comes down here, which is where the it comes up from there. No, Zherebets River comes up, maybe, I don't know what tributary it is, what river. Yeah, that is the Zherebets River. Sorry, I was having a second guessing what's going on, because there's another tributary that comes in and joins it around Zhirelne, and it comes down here, and that's where they've crossed around Karmazianivka. So they've got across the Zherebets River there, and that's where they made all these gains over the last week or so. But further up to the north, they're not across the Zherebets River, and they're attacking from Kuzymivka, and it could be that's where they're getting to. Talk of getting to the Oskil River is, frankly, a bit ridiculous. So I'm trying to make sense of that. Anyway, the Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces took up more advantageous positions near Kuzymivka. One Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces advanced to the shoreline of the Oskil River. Again, I can't make sense of that. And other mill bloggers reported heavy fighting is ongoing near Novoselivska, Novohayarivka, and we'll get to that in a second, and Nadia. Okay, so talk about getting to the shore of the Oskil River is, frankly, just fanciful. So that's why there's a bit of confusion for me there. Anyway, so there is possible movements for the Russians in the Kuzymivka and Novoselivska area, but most of the conversation is about what's happening around here by Ryhorodka and all the way down to Novovodyanye past Karmazianivka. You have several villages here that are being mentioned a lot. One of them is Nadia, and the other one is Novohayarivka. We have seen claims here, for example, from Suryat Maps here, that the Ukrainians have indeed pushed back in the area. The Ukrainian army launched a counterattack and retook full control over the village of Novohayarivka. On the other hand, Ukrainian troops reached the outskirts of Nadia, where clashes with the Russian army are currently taking place. I don't think that's, on the other hand, that's in tandem with that. So the claim here is that they've retaken Novohayarivka, but not yet taken Nadia. The claims yesterday from other sources were that Nadia was definitely liberated, as Ukrainian sources were saying that Nadia was liberated. So again, I think Syriac Maps is slow in adapting to Ukrainian pushbacks when it's very quick to adapt its mapping to Russian successes. Anyway, it seems that the Ukrainians there are pushing the Russians back in that sector quite successfully. Andrew Perpetua says, actually, no, we'll come to that in a second. We go to Radu Hosu, who is a Romanian analyst, says of this northern area that up into Kupiansk-Kreminna, or this whole front, the overall situation looks very bad for the Russians. What was announced as a force of 100,000 Russians, 900 tanks and 500 other armored vehicles, it seems that not only have they reached their peak, maximum point of offensive capability, but for 2 days they've been losing ground on the whole front. In the north, around Kupiansk, they are hemmed in, he says. So just if we go to Kupiansk, there was talk about them gaining some ground yesterday. Syriac Maps reported in this area that they gained some ground. If you remember, there's the Oskil River that comes down here. The thing is that the Russians are kind of pushing up against a very difficult geographical barrier in not only the river, but this high ground and bluffs just to the west of the river, where the Ukrainians have control and they're able to just, shoot at the Russians below and use their artillery and mortars and whatnot. And then they've got forest areas to the south, and it's quite a difficult place maybe for them to make large advances easily. So that's what he's saying there. But talking about further down south where we were, he goes on to say in the Svatova-Borova area, in the last 3 days, the Ukrainians have liberated as much as the Russians illegally conquered in 2 weeks, being about 2 kilometers from the front line before the loudly announced Russian counteroffensive. A few kilometers to the north in the Avdiivka, Drzelny area, and in the Novosibirsk areas, the contested area is right in favor of the Ukrainians, who have pushed back the Russians by about 4 to 5 kilometers in a week. Now, I wouldn't be quite so upbeat about it as that. I mean, yes, it's good and they are doing a lot better. I wouldn't say that we have seen the Ukrainians push the Russians back in the Novosibirsk area, though. I think that's maybe overstretching things a little bit. But I think the Russians are certainly finding themselves under a lot more pressure in this area, and then they are being pushed back towards where they started. But there is activity up and down this whole front line in a number of areas. So I don't think that the Russians are spent in the way that maybe is indicated by what Radu Hosu is saying there. I think there's certainly something to watch out for. Interestingly, Andrew Perpetua also talks about, a number of sources talk about how in the Chernihiv area, which is in the north of Ukraine, the Russians tried to attack over the border, and they were pushed back. So there's Chernihiv. I don't exactly know where they were pushing over the border, but a deep reconnaissance group was spotted with thermal imaging by the border patrol and were repulsed around there. So that's just something else to throw in. Something we haven't seen for some time. The Russians trying something in other places. I guess it's probably just to keep the Ukrainians on their toes again. But that is this kind of area. But as we come further down south to Kreminna, to the forest, there's quite a bit of activity there. The ISW continues. A Russian center grouping of forces spokesperson claimed that Russian forces captured 8 Ukrainian strongholds on the borders of Raya-Horodka and Chervona-Popivka. So that is back where we're talking about. So 8 spread between areas where we're talking about there, and then Chervona-Popivka, which is on the way to Kreminna. It's fairly unspecific, and I can't say anything more than not sure. Several Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces advanced in the Serebryantski forest area towards Liman, and they also reported that Russian forces tried to attack towards Bilohorivka but were unsuccessful. So Bilohorivka is down here, just below the forest. A lot of difficult fighting has taken place there over the last several months, and vague claims of gains or movements in the Serebryantski forest, but that's nothing unusual. So I think there's still quite a bit of activity going on here and lots more to expect. I think the Russians might try and push back unless they really are spent in the area, which would be pretty surprising. I mean, they do have fairly decent force concentrations here still, and although there may be 100,000 troops, that is to say, in this whole area here, there are 100,000 people. That's including logistics and so on and so forth. As far as frontline troops are concerned, it's probably more like, well, I don't know. There were claims that they moved 11,000 troops into this area just around the time the counteroffensive starting in order to do things like this. So they probably do have quite a bit more capacity still to be able to use in that area. How they use them, I don't know. I guess we will see. Right, we'll come on to the Bakhmut area. And interestingly here, the ISW says really very little. It says Russian forces did not conduct any claimed or confirmed ground attacks in the Bakhmut area. That I think it tells us quite a bit. So the Russians didn't do any of their usual kind of counterattacking. There were no claimed attacks by the Russians in this whole area. That's hugely surprising. And it says really Ukrainians didn't make any confirmed or claimed gains, but I wouldn't be so sure that that's actually the case. I would say let's actually look at some of the sources here. Andrew Perpetua's done some shelling analysis, and he's saying the position north of Klishchivka appears to be in Ukrainian control. Several days ago, we saw a video of Ukrainians attacking there, but it wasn't obvious the attack was successful in the video. But now we have video of the Russians shelling the position, and there he provides the evidence for that. Now, just to give you an idea of what he's talking about there, we have the Bakhmut city here, the area to the north, where there doesn't seem to be a lot of information coming out of the whole of the north, really. There's a lot more focus on what's going on in the Klishchivka area, the Avdiivka area, and the Kupiansk-Kreminna area to the south. We have the canal going north to south here, or kind of southeast, northwest to southeast, and then we have the railway track coming up here. I forgot to give you my map legend today. Remember, all the lines refer to Russian defensive lines. In the Bakhmut area, we have 3 lines. We have the blue of Andrew Perpetua, the red of Syriac maps, that's a pro-Ukrainian and a pro-Russian mapper, and then the yellow of Deep State map. Deep State hasn't updated anything for over 24 hours, so there's no movement in the yellow lines. And what we are seeing here, the white line, is the line before the counteroffensive began. So we can see the gains that the Ukrainians have made since the counteroffensive began, particularly south of Bakhmut and a little bit to the north, and then further to north along the M03 highway. But anyway, back to Klishchivka, just north of Klishchivka, this area of forestry, of woodland, was in Russian hands, and this is what Andrew Perpetua is saying is now under Ukrainian control, or certainly not under Russian control. It might be in a grey zone, but he's actually pushed Ukrainian control right up there, as far as I remember. Yeah, so right up to that railway line. He has Ukrainian control, so that is a change there. No report says of Bakhmut. Based on Ukrainian soldier reports, the main task now is destroying as much mortar and artillery in the close vicinity of Avdiivka and Klishchivka. Both are left by Russia, but can't be fully secured due to the lack of defensive positions and continuous shelling. So he is saying quite clearly that Klishchivka and Avdiivka, the Russians have left there. That would not be in accordance with the mapping of Syriac maps that has Klishchivka still fully under the control of the Russians. I just think that is absolutely not the case. And Deep State map that is behind the times still has Russian control of some of Klishchivka. Andrew Perpetua has for days not had that under Russian control, and I think it's far more accurate to say it's just a big grey zone at most. If not, Ukrainian have control over at least some of it. So we go back to Andrew Perpetua's map here. I don't know if we can see. Yeah, we can. So he has it basically entirely as a grey zone. The actual town itself, with the Ukrainian control basically going along the high ground behind, possibly a little bit of more contestation here. But essentially, Ukrainians controlling here. This is grey zone. And this is the Russian defensive line, as you can see. And it seems that they are being pushed right back to the railway line. We have seen FPV, first-person view drone footage of dugouts being hit on the eastern side of the railway here. So that kind of confirms that. And yesterday we saw the lines being pushed back slightly in Kupiansk as well, the Russian defensive line. So they're putting pressure on Kupiansk too. If we go back to Radio Hosu, he says of Bakhmut that it's slightly different analysis, but I would slightly more trust Andrew Perpetua, to be honest, here. To the south, he says, Avdiivka is apparently 100% abandoned, so that's an agreement by the Russians. Klishchiivka is less than 30% controlled by the Russians. I don't know that you'd be able to say it's controlled at all. I'd say there might be presence there, but I don't know that. I'd say it's just one big grey zone. In the north only, he says, and Kupiansk is currently a contested settlement. Thus, the Ukrainians are getting closer and closer to the T0513 road. So he's actually saying, different to what all the mappers are saying, he's saying the whole of Kupiansk is contested, which means the Russian defensive lines would be behind that, and that'd be a grey zone. But he is right in saying that this road is really where it's going to be at. The Russian defensive lines are set onto that. It is above it's on slightly higher ground. I'm going to try this out. I'm not very good at this, but we'll see if I can detect the higher ground. I think, you can see it's slightly raised going up there to the left, and then high ground there. It doesn't seem to raise too much up onto that, but I'm fairly sure. Over here you start getting higher ground, and yes, you can see higher ground indeed there. So this is somewhere where the Ukrainians would like to get purchased. So let's see that on the map more more precisely. So Mykolaiv, Druha, that looks to be on higher ground. It's slightly raised road there, and then we have the railway embankment going there. So anyway, that's to give you a little bit of an idea. I don't know how much that helped, but yes. So just to go back to Radu Hosu, he was saying that in the north, fighting is taking place in Yehidne, Dubovo, Vasilivka, Orokova, Vasilivka, and Bakivka. Here, the Ukrainians advance is much slower than in the south, and I'd agree with that. Bakhmut itself, I find this quite interesting. So Ukraine has significant part of the western part of town under artillery control, which is something they have said. In fact, Ukrainians have said, General Staff, that the whole of the city is basically under fire control, and the Russians are kind of hemmed in. They're tracked, has been the claim of the Ukrainian General Staff previously. Hosu then says that he says that raids by special forces are taking place almost daily, harassing the Russian defences, which are not getting to fortify the town. So it is, I think that is significant, where there is activity going on in the west here, but they're probably not going to go street to street fighting to march through the town. They're much more likely to be using special forces, as is indicated there. So slow advances. I've talked previously about how it's going to be, bite and hold, incremental gains for the Ukrainians, both north and south, so that they're not overstretching themselves, so they're not attriting their own forces at unsustainable rates. They want to take Bakhmut with the loss of far fewer troops than the Russians. I remember in this morning's news report, I was talking about how the Russians' sole metric for success was territorial gain. That is not the sole metric for success for the Ukrainians. Actually, what I think you'll find is territorial gain will come after Russians are attrited. So I think almost first and foremost, it's attriting the Russians, but also the other metric is not losing your own troops. If you do that successfully, you take the Russians out the picture and you don't lose your troops, then territorial exchange will come. Then control of those territories will come, because there won't be the Russian forces to control them. So I think possibly there's just a different way that they are going about this. They have different objectives, which means that it's much slower, but it will be, I think, more successful and sustainable going forward. What the Russians did was take territory at the expense of losing so many troops that they culminated and are now in a position where they're unable to effectively defend it without sending in huge amounts of resources and reinforcements. The Ukrainians are taking that ground back, but they don't need to pack in loads of reinforcements afterwards, because they've lost so many troops, because they're doing it sensibly and slowly. That's my analysis. Avdiivka, nothing to report. There's no reports of Ukrainian attacks in the area yesterday. The only thing that I can find on Avdiivka, I think, is actually, I've already reported, which is the armed forces of Ukraine knocked out Russian troops from a number of positions to the east of the village of Nevelsky. Now, I think I reported this a couple of days ago. Well, I know I did, but it's whether it's exactly the same place. They're talking about Andrew Perpetua showed this as a gain for the Ukrainians, as pushing the Russian defensive lines back. Syriac maps doesn't have that, and I think if you look at that map, we're talking about that area there, which I had shown being lost by the Russians previously. So really nothing on Avdiivka and nothing more on Bakhmut. So we close those. The ISW says very little about, I mean, that's the least I've seen on Avdiivka since I've been doing this, basically. So yeah, a quiet day in Avdiivka. And then we come to the Donetsk, the southern front line in Donetsk. We bypass Novomerkylivka, Marinenko, of course, Novomerkylivka and Vuhledar. No more news about Pavlivka and moving towards Vehorivka there. And we have some claims yesterday about Novomayorsky and Novodonetsk. They could be at least contested and possibly even under Ukrainian control now. I've not seen any evidence of that yet, but it wouldn't surprise me. Quite often we hear about things really 2 days after it's really happened. So there was also talk about the road being interdicted between Novodonetsk here and Kremenchik. So it could be that the Ukrainians are almost surrounding Novodonetsk. So wouldn't surprise me if the Russians pulled out there, and you see a flattening of this whole front line across this Donetsk into the Zaporizhia Oblast area. Pryutny, there is where the Zaporizhia Oblast border comes down, and there's quite a lot of talk about Pryutny. So let's go to look at some of the updates here. This is war front line that still has this salient there, but you'll see in a second. So let's show that on my map here. Both mappers have that salient under Russian control. So these are Russian defensive lines are here. Andrew Perpetua and Syriac maps, and war front line has that as well. But they say progress southwest of Staromyorsk towards Zabitny is taking place, and about 25 to 30% of Urizhny has been liberated. So that is here. As you can see, Syriac maps has some gains for the Ukrainians, and we'll talk about that in a second. But 25 to 30% of Urizhny is, according to that source, under Ukrainian control or not under Russian control, which means the Russian front line is probably something like that. And the Ukrainians are coming down here. The Russians really are probably surrounded like this on three sides, with the Ukrainians confirmed to be in control of Staromyorsk and a river between them. But this area is going to be fairly difficult to supply, as we see. You know, here that you have to come up through this one road, and it's just going into this area that there will be fire control over that supply road, no doubt. So yeah, potential Russian gains here, but that's with a dot after it. So that's JR. Thanks, JR, who helps me with this. He does the Syriac maps uploads on most days, and that's really appreciated because I am so busy. Anyway, this means that it's not something they've announced, but there's just a rejig. So it's more likely that's a rejigging rather than the Russians have actually made advances there. Anyway, Syriac maps says, well, go to no reports because that's what I was going to talk about. If you see here, just by Pryutny, let's expand that a little bit. You'll notice that there's no salient there that I was just talking about. So they have pretty much a straight Russian defensive line right across that whole sector. So if you look at this sector, their Russian defensive line looks more like this. So it's kind of that. And a larger grey zone. And there's probably a lot to be said for that. It's likely that most places are going to be hotly contested. He says that in this axis, or in this sector, the Russian sources confirm or reconfirm Staromyorsk is in Ukrainian hands. So this is the claim from, if you remember from Syriac maps, that it was under control of the Ukrainians, and then the Russians did a counterattack. And indeed, Syriac maps does say something about this. if you remember, this was the original claim that the Russians launched a counterattack, and then that was basically called out by people like Romanov, who's a Russian source that has connections, ultra-nationalists. And then he's once again refuting that Russian and DPR channels are saying that there was this, a counterattack. This time he mocks Alexei Akutin, a journalist, so-called journalist, and representative of the so-called DPR that claims units of the Russian Fifth Army counterattacked in Staromilsk, calling it pure nonsense. So he's saying this is absolute nonsense. Syriac was then called out on this, and then he goes on a big rant, or they go on a big rant about saying disinformation is a great scourge of our time. Sure it is, and it comes from you guys, and is often used as a weapon against people. As an example of this, we had the latest events at Staromilsk a few hours ago. The news was published that Russian forces had launched an attack and managed to take positions around the city, killing some Ukrainian soldiers. The kind of action could be considered a skirmish rather than a recapture operation. Yeah, but he has it down as a recapture, so he's kind of walking stuff back. Anyway, he goes on and then just bemoans being called out by Global War Monitor and people, accusations that as Global War Monitor said, Syriac isn't reliable. He claimed that Russia retook Staromilsk, which they haven't. Also, this was confirmed literally by the brigade fighting in that area. Deep state is very delayed, so on and so forth. And then, like Syriac Maps, then whinges about trolls and this and that and disinformation. It's like, no, actually, you are just towing the Russian MOD line here, and I think actually people were right to call you out. I still use Syriac Maps. I think it is a useful source. I think it's useful to know what both sides are claiming. So I will keep using them, but I will tell you sometimes they're slow to readjust in favor of Ukraine, and they're often good in where Russia are making gains, but usually in more like larger Russian attacks rather than just a little counterattack there, which I think they're just like hopeful in Russia taking back what they just lost. I think there's like a hopefulness there. But anyway, to go back to what Noah Reports was saying, preliminary info coming out is that Novodonetsk and Novomayorsk, might be in Ukrainian hands, but he's waiting for confirmation. He's expanded the grey zone there. Ukrainians are pushing southwards between Priyutny and Staromilsk and the flanks of Uruzhany. So between Priyutny and Staromilsk, he's having the Ukrainians attacking there. That is in this area, this big sort of area of Russian control. So it could well be that is grey zone, and it could be that actually the Ukrainians are pushing towards Zavitne south of Staromilsk, and that would really cause problems for the Russians in Uruzhany that are holding out there, because basically it looks like then they'd be entirely encircled if the Ukrainians could push further south along the river, take Zavitne, and then the Russians would be somewhat stuck there. But so that is the information coming out of this region. Nothing too much more to say. I think the Ukrainians will just be incrementally, rather similar to south of Bakhmut, taking land around here. Of course, at some point they're going to have some major attack where they burst through the Russian defenses. But remember, you don't start seeing those major defenses till much further south here. The Russian Surovikin line is I don't know exactly, but it's south. Oh no, it's not there. I think it's more like here. It's south of Staromilnyivka there. So once they get to there, you're starting to reach the Surovikin lines, and that will be where you would want to see them do that larger sort of punch through, because then after that there are relatively few large trenches and defensive lines in this area. This is possibly why they're attacking around Velika Novosilka, because once you get past those defenses, actually it's kind of plain sailing all the way to Mariupol and arguably Berdyansk. Whereas when you're attacking in the Robotny area, as I've said many times before, you've got 3 or 4 lines of defense here that you've got to fight through. Once you're through one and exhausted, you've then got to continue onto the next, and then the next, and then Tokmak itself is completely surrounded. So this is a much easier route, arguably, from Velika Novosilka downwards, but they still got quite a bit to go before they reach those initial lines. Anyway, Robotna, let's go to see what's happening there. ISW, we go back to beforehand, let's just see what Radu Hosu has to say about where we've just been, which is the Staromilska area. Velika Novosilka, having conquered Staromilska 4 days ago, Ukrainian filler units have arrived in the area to fortify and protect it. On the eastern bank of the river, they're advancing through Uruzhany. The Surovikin line has also been reached along the axis. I don't know where that is. Only here do the Russians have big defensive problems. If further west, they have created a defense in depth that is extremely difficult to penetrate, being in consecutive layers a few kilometers apart, occupying topographically superior positions on this axis after Staromilska. There is little to stop the Ukrainians from reaching Mariupol or Berdyansk, which is just what I said. But I'm not sure that the Ukrainians have reached that Surovikin line in that area. And anyway, as we come on to the Orikhiv position, the sector here, just south of Malotokmacha and on to Robotna, he says, from what information appears from sources, in the Robotna area, the Ukrainians are attempting an envelopment similar to the Battle of Gazala, second battle for Tobruk in World War II, when Rommel avoided fortification lines and mined areas by drawing an arc around the back of the fortifications. In the coming days, we will see whether or not this is a tactic used and whether it will succeed. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are advancing towards Verbova. Basically, they are in front of the first seriously fortified line and the so-called Surovikin line. Right, so lots of claims about that. Not too much information coming out of here. No changes to the map as far as I can see. The question is whether they are still... Yeah, I still think that they have advanced past the first part of the Surovikin line here, but as it comes down further towards Verbove, I think, you know, it's under Russian control. But, you know, it would be interesting to see whether they could fight down the trench line there. Anyway, there has been a lack of information coming out from here. Although over the last few days since that kind of disastrous attack, Global War Monitor says Ukraine has regained some lost positions. And I think that's positions they gained but then lost as a result of that attack or around that attack. As they are shelled by unguided rockets from Russian helicopters. They have still made 2.2 square kilometers of liberated status territory there. So it could be that the Ukrainians are making some gains in that area, although no report says no map changes. The 15th Operational Brigade, Kara-Dag, has started offensive actions towards Novopokrovka, and there's quite a bit of footage coming out from them that you can see online, and that is in this area. The Ukrainians have been trying to attack just south of there for quite a long time now, without too much success. They've lost quite a bit of equipment around there over time, but yeah, they are active there. And for the last few days, this Kara-Dag brigade has been working. We have seen some footage claiming advances which couldn't be tracked back to a particular area yet. He goes on to show that footage there, which you can check online. There's quite a bit of battle footage coming out from that area. And then when we move to the west, so I'm interested to see what is going on there. There's quite a bit of fog of war, as you'd expect from an attack that was so big but not quite successful. What are the Ukrainians doing? They're probably keeping things quite quiet now. They're trying to manage that. But I don't really know what the Russians are doing either, and not too much information. Then again, Piatikhetki, not too much information coming from there, considering this is an area where the Russians have put up fierce resistance and the Ukrainians have basically got pretty much stuck. There are some minor gains just north of Zherebianki there, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and he says Ukraine appears to have advanced in this area south of Kupiansk, where Ukraine has been progressing south for over a week, and north of Zherebianki. In satellite imagery yesterday, we see brand new fires in this area. So he looks at satellite imagery, sees that there are, instead of shelling along this tree line, it's along this tree line, and so he moves the Russian defensive line further back. They've been pushed further back, which I signify as a Ukrainian gain. Not too much granular news coming out of this Kamyansky area, where the Ukrainians have successfully pushed the Russians back over the last week or so. But yeah, Zherebianki still, as a small settlement, still holds. There are a lot of entrenchments in the fields, every tree line. has trenches and dugouts, so it's difficult to make serious gains in the area. As we go back to ISW, the area, yeah, not too much to say about Staromilsk. We'll come here. A Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malia has reported that Ukrainian forces made unspecified advances in the Malatok-Kamachka-Robotna area direction, so that they are claiming to make advances there. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces repelled a limited mechanized Ukrainian attack near Robotna and a smaller ground attack on the Piatikatki-Sherebianki line. And that's basically all they have to say about the rest of the front line. We'll just say one thing about Kherson, or I guess maybe a couple of things. So that's the front line, somewhat quiet, but you know there are things happening, particularly I think in the Velika Novosilka area. So coming to look at what is going on in the Antonivsky Bridge area, Rebar, the pro-Russian source, I haven't had too much time to delve too much into Rebar over the last few days, just from a time point of view, but I don't think they're making any significant claims outside of what I've been reporting. But here they are, as Osint Yuri says, Rebar are claiming that Russian attempts to eliminate the Ukrainian incursions on the left bank of occupied Kherson have failed. A quote, this is what Rebar say, a very unpleasant situation is developing near the Antonovsky Bridge, where Ukrainian formations not only hold a bridgehead, but also try to move deep into the territory on the left bank of the Dnieper. Despite the systematic fire strike, the enemy reaches the southernmost islands, and artillery from Sadova on the right bank delivers harassing blows on the northern outskirts of Oleshki. So he's saying, in this Antonivsky Bridge area, and there's been no change from Andrew Perpetua. I've been waiting to see him change this area of Russian control, because I have heard previously from no reports that the Russians have pulled back to Oleshki. And that's not signified by Perpetua's mapping, but it might be quite difficult to get that information. I don't know. But anyway, from Sadova here, the Ukrainians are hammering Oleshki with their artillery, and that is something that is upsetting Rebar here. Despite the systematic fire strike, the enemy reaches the southernmost islands, and artillery from Sadova is hammering Oleshki. The problem of the presence of the enemy on the left bank of the Dnieper has not gone away. Attacks do not seem to pose a serious threat, but due to their systematic nature, they are dangerous in the future. Perhaps the countermeasures being taken are not effective enough, and now is the time to change something. So he's saying, he's basically kind of doom mongering here by saying, look, if we don't sort something out here, this could end up being an area where the Ukrainians could take advantage, where they could get across the river in a more meaningful way and use it as a springboard to attack from the west, and thus cause problems for the Russians, I guess, in the Zaporizhia front line. Will they have to bring troops down here? Does that thin out the defenses even more? You know, and he's saying that now's the time to act. So that is something definitely to look out for, and especially when you also hear about the Ukrainians trying to hammer the Russians on the Khinvan Peninsula. Here, artillery has hit and destroyed an entrenched observation and firing post. Now, whether that is a defensive decision from the Ukrainian forces over in the Mykolaiv Oblast here, because the Russians hammer Ochakiv quite consistently, or attempt to, from the Khinvan Peninsula, is this a case of like hitting them as a defensive move, or is it ahead of maybe some potential move onto the peninsula to help, you know, attack the Russians from the west? I don't know. Anyway, that's the Frontline update for the 1st of August. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. I've got a little bit of an extended piece of the news coming out next that will be concerning Niger. So check out for that. Sorry, there's so much content coming out, but there's just a lot of news today that if I don't get it out, it just goes around my head like a multi-ball pinball machine, and causes havoc in my own brain. So I splurge it out onto YouTube, and you guys can watch it or choose not to. You're not forced to. Anyway, thanks. See you later.